Keep your money, the man said quietly, his voice cutting through the soft clink of silverware. You're going to need it more than I ever will. The restaurant didn't go silent all at once. It froze in fragments, a fork hovering midair, a glass pausing just before a sip, a conversation dissolving into unfinished words. All eyes shifting toward the corner where a young black waitress stood with 10 crumpled dollars in her hand, and a billionaire who looked like he had just dismissed something far more valuable than cash. Amara Johnson didn't move, not immediately, her fingers still extended, the thin bills trembling slightly under the weight of every hour she had worked that week, the late-night shifts, the double tips that never came, the careful counting of coins on her kitchen table just to make sure the light stayed on. $10 wasn't just money. It was dinner. It was bus fare. It was tomorrow. And yet here she was offering it to a man in a tailored navy suit, whose watch alone could pay her rent for a year. The overhead lights cast a warm glow across polished marble floors, reflecting off crystal glasses and designer shoes. A room built on excess now quietly watching a moment it didn't quite understand. Daniel Whitmore didn't look like a man in need, his posture straight, his expression calm, almost detached, but there had been something in the way he had reached for his pocket moments earlier, a flicker, brief but real, like a glitch in a system that wasn't supposed to fail. Amara had seen it, not because she was looking for it, but because people like her always noticed the things others ignored. The small hesitations, the silent discomforts, the moments where power cracked just enough to reveal something human underneath. She had walked over without being called, without permission, without thinking about how it would look, and simply placed the $10 in front of him like it was the most natural thing in the world. A man at a nearby table let out a quiet chuckle, not loud enough to be rude, just enough to be heard. And someone else whispered something about desperation disguised as kindness. But Amara didn't react. She never did. Not when customers snapped their fingers, not when they spoke over her, not when they looked through her like she was part of the furniture. She had learned a long time ago that dignity wasn't something you waited for. It was something you carried, even when no one else bothered to notice. Daniel glanced at the money again, then back at her, studying her face like it held a question he hadn't expected to ask, and for a brief second, something shifted in his eyes. Not pity, not amusement, something quieter, something almost unfamiliar. Why would you do that? He asked, not as a challenge, but as if he genuinely didn't understand. And that was the part that made a few heads turn, because men like him weren't used to asking questions like that. Amara shrugged slightly, her voice calm, steady, unshaken. Because you needed it, she said, as if that was enough, as if that explained everything. The room held its breath again, not because of what she said, but because of how simple it sounded, how out of place it felt in a world where everything had a price tag and nothing came without expectation. Daniel exhaled slowly, then pushed the money back toward her, not harshly, not dismissively, but with a finality that carried weight. Keep it, he said again, softer this time. You'll need it more than I do. And just like that, the moment should have ended. Another small, forgettable exchange in a city full of them. But it didn't, because somewhere in the room, unnoticed by most, a phone had lifted, a message had been sent, and something far bigger than $10 had just been set into motion. The moment dissolved the way expensive moments always do, quietly, without applause. The room exhaling as conversations slowly stitched themselves back together. Forks resumed their rhythm. Glasses met lips again. And yet something invisible lingered in the air. Something unsettled, like a question no one could quite name. Amara stepped back, her hand closing gently around the $10 as if she had just retrieved more than paper. Her face unchanged, her posture steady, and without another word she turned and walked toward the service station, her steps measured, unhurried, as though nothing significant had just happened. But behind her, eyes followed, not out of respect, not yet, but curiosity, the kind that grows when something does not fit the rules people are used to. Daniel remained seated, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table, his gaze drifting for a moment before settling on the empty space where the money had been, his expression unreadable, but his mind no longer in the room, because men like him were trained to notice patterns, to detect signals, and what had just happened did not align with anything he had built his world on. Generosity without leverage, kindness without expectation, a transaction with no return. It was inefficient, illogical, and yet it had landed heavier than any negotiation he had. Closed in the past year. A server approached cautiously, asking if he would like anything else, and he shook his head once, slow, deliberate, as if declining something far larger than dessert. Across the room, near the bar, a man in a charcoal suit lowered his phone after sending a message, his eyes scanning the space with quiet precision, while another guest leaned in to whisper to someone beside him, their expressions shifting from amusement to something closer to intrigue. Amara picked up a tray, her hands steady despite the faint pulse still echoing in her chest, and returned to her section, refilling water glasses, clearing plates, moving through the room with the same quiet efficiency she always had, because life did not pause for moments like that. Bills still waited, responsibilities did not disappear, and tomorrow would come whether tonight meant something or not. But as she passed by a mirrored column, she caught her own reflection for just a second, the uniform, the tied back hair, the calm face, and behind it, something else, something grounded, something unshaken, and she held on to that as she moved forward. Daniel finally stood, adjusting his jacket with a small, practiced motion, and for a brief moment, he hesitated, his eyes searching the room until they found her again, not as a waitress this time, but as a variable he could not yet define. He walked past her without stopping, without speaking, but not without noticing, and as the doors closed behind him, and the night air swallowed his silhouette, the city outside remained unaware that something had just shifted, not in headlines, not in markets, but in something quieter, something human. Inside, the restaurant returned fully to its rhythm, laughter rising, music filling the spaces between conversations, and yet somewhere beyond the walls, engines were already starting, messages were being forwarded, names were being mentioned, and a chain of events had begun to unfold, not because of strategy, not because of power, but because one person had given $10 when she had every reason not to, and somewhere in that simple act, a system that rarely noticed people like her had just been forced to pay attention. The night ended the way long nights always do, not with closure but with exhaustion, the kind that settles into your bones as Amara stepped out of the restaurant into the cool air just past midnight. The city quieter now, streetlights casting long reflections across the pavement, her shoes aching, her shoulders tight, and that same $10 still folded in her pocket, untouched, unchanged, as if it had absorbed the weight of something she could not quite explain. The bus stop was 3 blocks away, and she walked it like she always did, steady, aware, her eyes catching details others ignored, a flickering sign, a cab slowing too long at the corner, the distant hum of traffic rolling through the city like a low breath. When the bus finally came, it was nearly empty, just a man asleep near the back and a woman staring out the window with headphones on. And Amara slid into her usual seat, second row from the front, her hands resting in her lap, her thoughts quieter than usual. Not heavy, not confused, just still. She reached into her pocket and unfolded the $10, smoothing it against her knee, looking at it not as something lost or saved, but as something chosen, and that distinction mattered more than she expected. Across town, in a glass-walled office high above the city, lights flicked on one by one as Daniel Whitmore stepped inside, his presence enough to shift the energy of the entire floor. Assistants straightening, screens waking, conversations lowering into focused silence, because men like him did not return to work after midnight unless something had disrupted the expected order of things. He did not sit immediately, instead walking to the window, looking out over a skyline he had spent years learning how to control, and yet tonight, control felt like the wrong word, because what had happened in that restaurant had not been control, it had been something else entirely. Pull the list, he said finally, his voice calm, measured, and within seconds a screen behind him lit up, names appearing, numbers aligning, networks connecting, a quiet machine already moving faster than most people would ever realize. This was not impulsive. This was precise, intentional, the kind of response reserved for moments that revealed something rare. Back on the bus, Amara leaned her head lightly against the window, watching reflections blur past, her stop approaching, her mind already shifting toward what tomorrow would demand, rent due in a week, her brother's medication running low, another double shift waiting with no guarantee of tips, the math of survival, never taking a night off. She stepped off the bus and walked the last half-mile to her apartment, a small building tucked between a laundromat and a corner store, the hallway dim but familiar, the door creaking slightly as she pushed it open and stepped inside, greeted by the quiet that only comes from a space you fight to keep. She set her bag down, placed the $10 on the table, and for a moment just stood there, looking at it, not with regret, not with pride, just acknowledgement, like a marker of a choice that did not need validation. Somewhere across the city, engines turned over in sequence, doors opened, calls connected, and a network of people who rarely moved without purpose had just been given one, not by a contract, not by a deal, but by a moment so small most would have missed it, except they did not. And as the city drifted toward sleep, something else was quietly waking up, something coordinated, something deliberate, something that would arrive not with noise, but with presence, and when morning came, it would not ask for attention, it would command it. At 6:12 a.m., the city had not fully woken up yet, but the street outside Amara's apartment was already different, not louder, not chaotic, just deliberate, like something had arrived before the day had a chance to begin. The first sound was not an engine revving, but the quiet glide of a car door closing, then another, each one measured, precise, as if even noise had been instructed to behave. Amara did not notice it at first. She was in the kitchen, standing barefoot on cool tile, pouring the last of the milk into a chipped mug, her mind already calculating the hours ahead, the shift starting at 8, the bus she could not miss, the bills she could not delay. Routine wrapping around her like armor. But then came a knock, not aggressive, not hesitant, just certain, and that alone made her pause, because no one knocked like that in her building. Not neighbors, not delivery drivers, not anyone who belonged to her world. She walked to the door slowly, wiping her hands on a towel, her instincts alert but calm, and when she opened it, the hallway looked the same for half a second, the dim light, the worn carpet, the faint hum of the building's old wiring. And then she saw past it, through the open front entrance, where the street should have been empty, where it never held anything more than a parked sedan or two, but today it held something else entirely, a line of cars, not one or two, but many, stretching along the curb with a kind of quiet symmetry, each one polished, each one still, each one reflecting the early morning light like mirrors placed on purpose. Men and women stood beside them, not crowded, not loud, spaced evenly, dressed in a way that did not demand attention but commanded it anyway. Tailored coats, clean lines, eyes focused not on the building itself, but on her door. Amara did not step out, not yet, because her world had taught her that when something looks too different, you do not rush toward it, you understand it first. One of the individuals stepped forward, not fast, not slow, just enough to close the distance without breaking the quiet. A man in his 50s, composed, carrying nothing in his hands but presence, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same tone as the knock, steady, intentional. Amara Johnson, he said, not asking, but confirming, and she nodded once, her grip tightening slightly on the edge of the door. He offered a small, respectful incline of his head, not exaggerated, not performative, just acknowledgement, and then he stepped aside, gesturing subtly toward the street behind him, where the others now began to move, not all at once, but in sequence, like something rehearsed without ever being announced. One woman opened the trunk of her car, revealing a stack of neatly arranged folders. Another carried a small box. Another held a tablet already active, screens glowing with information that seemed to exist before this moment ever began. Amara's eyes moved from one detail to the next, not overwhelmed, but searching, trying to understand the pattern, the reason, the cause, because nothing like this ever arrived without one. And then she saw it, at the far end of the line, a familiar figure stepping out of a car she recognized not by brand, but by presence. Daniel Whitmore, the same man from the night before, the same calm expression, the same measured movements, but now placed in a context that made everything else align. He did not rush forward. He did not call out. He simply walked, closing the distance step by step until he stood within speaking range. And for a brief moment, the entire street seemed to hold its breath again, just like the restaurant had. But this time, it was not confusion that filled the space. It was anticipation, the kind that comes when something unseen is finally about to be revealed. Daniel stopped a few feet from the doorway, close enough to be heard without raising his voice, far enough to leave her space. And for a moment he said nothing, as if allowing the weight of the scene to settle before adding to it. Amara held his gaze, not confrontational, not welcoming, just steady. The same quiet strength she had carried the night before, the same refusal to perform for anyone else's expectations. "You offered me $10, he said finally, his tone even, almost reflective, like he was still examining the moment himself. "Without asking who I was, without asking what you would get in return." And a faint shift moved through the line of people behind him, not distraction, but recognition, as if this was the point they had all been waiting to hear spoken aloud. Amara did not respond immediately, because to her, the statement did not feel extraordinary. It felt obvious. The kind of thing you do when someone needs help, but the way he said it made it sound like something else entirely, something rare. "I did not need the money," he continued, not with arrogance, but with clarity. "But I needed to know if people like you still existed." And that was when the meaning began to land, not as a shock, but as a slow, unfolding realization that this was never about $10, never about a missed payment or a moment of weakness, but about something he had been searching for long before she ever walked over. One of the individuals stepped forward, the woman with the folders, and handed a single envelope to Daniel, who took it without breaking eye contact with Amara, then extended it toward her, not pushing it into her hands, just offering it, giving her the choice to accept or not. She hesitated, not out of fear, but because she understood instinctively that whatever was inside was not small, and accepting it would mean stepping into something she did not yet fully understand. "What is this?" she asked quietly, her voice grounded, and Daniel gave the slightest nod, as if acknowledging that the question mattered. "It is not a reward," he said, and the words were precise, deliberate. "It is a response." And behind him, the others began to move again, opening cases, unlocking tablets, organizing documents with a rhythm that suggested this had been planned with care, not impulse. The man from earlier stepped forward once more, holding a tablet now, its screen angled toward Amara, displaying figures, names, structures that did not belong to her world, at least not yet, while another placed the small box gently on a nearby surface, opening it to reveal something simple but significant, a set of keys, not flashy, not symbolic, just real. Amara looked from one detail to the next, her mind moving quickly but her body remaining still, grounded in the doorway that had always separated her life from everything beyond it. And now that boundary felt thinner than it ever had. "There are 50 of us," Daniel said, his voice carrying just enough for everyone to hear. "And each of us built something from nothing, not because we were given a chance, but because we refused to wait for one." And a quiet agreement seemed to pass through the group, not spoken, but understood. "Last night," he continued, "you did not wait, you acted." And for the first time, there was something in his expression that was not measured, not controlled, something closer to respect. Amara finally reached out, her fingers closing around the envelope, not quickly, not reluctantly, just with intention, the same way she had offered the $10. And in that motion, something shifted again, not just in her world, but in theirs, because this was no longer observation, no longer a test. This was participation, and once that line was crossed, there was no returning to the version of life that existed before it. The envelope felt heavier than paper should, not because of what it weighed, but because of what it implied, and Amara held it in both hands for a moment before opening it, her fingers careful, deliberate, as if rushing would somehow change what was inside. The street remained quiet, not empty, but respectful, the line of people waiting without pressure, without impatience, giving her the space to process something that had already begun to reshape her reality. When she finally slid her finger beneath the seal and opened it, the first thing she saw was not a check, not a number meant to overwhelm, but a letter, typed cleanly, signed at the bottom with names she did not recognize yet, but would soon understand carried weight far beyond the page. Her eyes moved slowly across the words, each sentence building on the last, not promising instant wealth, not offering a shortcut, but outlining something far more structured, far more intentional, a fully funded education program, access to mentorship, housing support, and an ownership stake in a new business initiative designed specifically for individuals who had proven something no resume could capture. She paused, her breath catching just slightly, not from disbelief, but from the unfamiliar clarity of it all, because this was not charity, it was architecture, a system built to change a trajectory, not just a moment. It is a foundation, Daniel said quietly, watching her read, his voice steady. Not the kind that gives you something and disappears, but the kind that stands under you while you build. And there was no performance in his tone, no attempt to impress, just explanation, as if he understood that anything less would not earn her trust. Amara looked up briefly, her eyes searching his face for something, a flaw, a condition, a hidden expectation, but found none that matched what she had been taught to expect from people in positions like his. Behind him, the woman with the folders stepped forward again, opening one and revealing documents neatly organized, timelines, projections, names of institutions, each detail reinforcing that this was not spontaneous generosity. It was coordinated opportunity. Another individual stepped closer with the tablet, tapping once to display a schedule, meetings already arranged, introductions prepared, doors unlocked before she had even known they existed. The small box with the keys remained open beside her, no explanation needed, just a quiet statement that her current situation had already been accounted for. Amara's grip tightened slightly on the letter, not out of fear, but grounding, anchoring herself in the moment so it would not drift into something unreal. Why me? She asked, not loudly, not emotionally, just directly, because the question mattered more than anything else being offered. Daniel did not answer immediately, not because he did not know, but because he chose. His words with care, understanding that this answer would define everything that followed. Because you gave when it made no sense, he said finally, his voice calm but certain. And people who can do that are the ones who build things that last. And the simplicity of it landed deeper than any complex explanation could have. Amara looked back down at the letter, then at the keys, then at the people standing in front of her. And for the first time since the knock on her door, something shifted. Inside her, not hesitation, not fear, but possibility. The kind that does not ask permission. The kind that changes the direction of a life without needing to announce itself. And in that quiet realization, the $10 from the night before no longer felt small. It felt like the moment everything began. Amara did not step out of the doorway right away, even with the letter in her hands and the quiet certainty of everything around her. Because stepping forward meant crossing from the life she understood into one she had never been invited into before. And that kind of shift did not happen with a single decision. It happened in layers. The morning air felt different now, sharper, more defined, as if even the light had adjusted to what was unfolding. And for a moment, she glanced back over her shoulder, into the small apartment behind her, the narrow kitchen, the worn table, the space where every dollar had always been accounted for, every choice measured against survival. That world had not disappeared. It was still there, still real, and that mattered, because it was the reason she stood the way she did now, grounded, not overwhelmed. When she turned back, Daniel had not moved, the others had not rushed. No one had tried to fill the silence, and that restraint said more than anything else could have, because it meant this was not about pressure, it was about permission. Amara stepped forward, one foot across the threshold, then the other, not dramatic, not hesitant, just intentional. And the moment her feet touched the pavement, something shifted again, subtle but undeniable, like a line had been crossed that could not be redrawn. The woman with the folders handed her a second document, this one simpler. A schedule for the next 72 hours, clear, structured, beginning not weeks from now but today, meetings, introductions, a walkthrough of the space connected to the keys now resting in her hand. The man with the tablet adjusted the screen, highlighting a section labeled ownership, percentages broken down, her name already placed within it, not as an afterthought, not as a placeholder, but as a foundation piece of something being built. Amara's eyes moved carefully over each detail, not rushing, not skipping, because she understood instinctively that this was not about being impressed. It was about being informed. Nothing here requires you to become someone else, Daniel said, his voice calm, carrying just enough weight to anchor the moment. It requires you to become more of who you already are. And that distinction settled into the space between them with clarity. A slight movement caught her attention as one of the individuals stepped aside, revealing a modest but clean vehicle parked closer than the others. Not extravagant, not excessive, just practical. Ready, and suddenly the pieces connected, not in a way that overwhelmed her, but in a way that made sense. Every detail aligned with purpose, not display. Amara let out a slow breath she had not realized she was holding, her shoulders lowering just slightly, not in relief, but in acceptance, and she folded the letter carefully before placing it back in the envelope, not as something fragile, but as something valuable. If I say yes, she began, her voice steady, meeting Daniel's eyes directly. This is real. And he nodded once, without hesitation, without embellishment. It already is, he replied. There was no applause, no dramatic reaction, just a quiet understanding that the moment had shifted again, from offering to decision, from possibility to direction. And as Amara took another step forward, closer to the street, closer to the line of people who had arrived not to watch her, but to stand with her, the life she had known did not disappear. It expanded, stretching beyond what she had ever been allowed to imagine, all because she had once chosen to give something small without asking for anything in return. The first step away from the doorway did not feel like walking into something new. It felt like stepping into something that had already been set in motion long before she understood it. And as Amara moved toward the modest car waiting for her, the others adjusted around her not as a spectacle, but as a system aligning itself to a new center. No one rushed ahead. No one hovered too close. Each movement precise, respectful, as if they all understood that what mattered most in this moment was not what they could give her, but how they allowed her to receive it. The door of the car opened quietly, not by a driver rushing to impress, but by a woman who simply nodded once, offering the space without words, and Amara paused for half a second before stepping inside, her hand still holding the envelope, the keys resting lightly against her palm, grounding her in something real as the door closed with a soft, final sound that separated what had been from what was beginning. Through the window, she could still see Daniel standing where he had been, not watching her like an owner observing a decision, but like someone who had completed a responsibility and was now allowing it to unfold. The car moved forward smoothly, merging into the street without drawing attention, yet everything about it carried intention, the route already mapped, the destination already prepared, the next steps already waiting. Inside, the world felt quieter, not because it was empty, but because it was focused. And Amara leaned back slightly, her eyes moving over the city she had always known, but now from a different angle, one where the buildings looked less like barriers and more like structures she might one day enter on her own terms. The woman in the front seat spoke gently, not turning around, her tone professional but warm, explaining the first stop, a space prepared for her, not temporary, not symbolic, but functional, a place where she could begin immediately, not tomorrow, not someday, but now. Amara listened without interrupting, absorbing each detail, not letting excitement rush ahead of understanding, because she had learned that what lasts is built on clarity, not impulse. When the car pulled into a clean, modern building just 15 minutes away, she noticed how ordinary it looked from the outside. No grand entrance, no towering signs, just a quiet structure that did not need to prove anything. And that alone told her something important. This was not about appearance. It was about purpose. Inside, the space was ready, not decorated to impress, but arranged to function. A desk, a computer, documents already organized, her name placed where it belonged, not as a guest, but as a participant. As she stepped out of the car and into that space, the transition completed itself, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that settled into her posture, into the way she held her shoulders, into the way she looked at the room not as something she had entered, but as something she was now part of. And somewhere behind her, across the city, the line of cars had already begun to disappear. each person returning to their own world, not because their role had ended, but because it had been fulfilled, leaving behind not a moment, not a gift, but a foundation that would continue to move forward, built on something as simple and as powerful as a decision made with $10 and no expectation of anything in return. The room did not celebrate her arrival. It adjusted to it, quietly, efficiently, as if it had always been waiting for her to take that exact step. And Amara stood there for a moment, not overwhelmed, not unsure, but aware, deeply aware that everything in front of her had been built with intention, and now it included her. The desk was simple, the screen already awake, a document open with her name at the top, not in bold, not highlighted, just placed where it belonged, like it had been there all along. And that subtlety mattered more than anything extravagant ever could. She set the envelope down beside the keyboard, placing the keys next to it, aligning them without thinking, her movements steady, grounded, the same way they had always been when she carried trays through crowded rooms, when she balanced orders and expectations without dropping either. Outside the glass wall, people moved with purpose. Conversations happening in low tones, decisions being made in real time, and for the first time, she was not passing through that world, she was inside it, part of its rhythm, part of its direction. A notification appeared on the screen, her first scheduled meeting in 10 minutes, a name she did not recognize yet, but would soon come to understand, and beneath it, a note already prepared, concise, clear, outlining exactly where she would begin, not at the bottom, not observing, but contributing. Amara exhaled slowly, not from nerves, but from recognition, because this was not a sudden transformation, it was a continuation, the same awareness, the same discipline, the same quiet strength, now placed in a space that could expand it instead of limit it. Across the city, Daniel stood once more at the window of his office, looking out over the skyline that had once defined his version of success, and for the first time in a long while, it felt incomplete, not because it lacked power, but because it lacked something he had only just begun to understand. One of his associates stepped beside him, tablet in hand, ready to report outcomes, projections, numbers that would normally matter. But Daniel raised his hand slightly, stopping the flow before it began, his attention still fixed on the distance, where somewhere within that city, a different kind of return had already begun. Did she accept? The associate asked quietly, and Daniel nodded once, not with satisfaction, but with something closer to respect, something earned, not given. Back in the office, Amara reached for the mouse, her hand steady as she clicked open the first document, her eyes scanning, processing, not intimidated, not rushed, just focused, the same way she had always approached everything that mattered. The noise of her past did not disappear, it did not need to. It remained as foundation, as reference, as truth, but it no longer defined the limits of where she could go. And in that quiet, deliberate moment, as she began her first task in a place she had never imagined entering, the meaning of everything that had happened settled into something simple, something undeniable. She had not been chosen because she needed help. She had been chosen because she had proven something rare, something that could not be taught, something that could not be bought. And as the screen reflected softly in her eyes, steady and clear, the world did not feel larger. It felt more open, because sometimes the smallest act, done without expectation, does not just change a moment. It changes the direction of everything that comes after.